Welcome to Avoice, a voice for creators. I'm your host, Daniel Norton. In this episode, we're going to talk about when not to take a job as a freelancer. I've also got an email from Mark about going pro, as it would be, and a great review. So let's get to it. This week, I want to talk about when not to take a job. So many of us as photographers work as what you would call freelancers. That is, we have our own business. Clients contact us, we negotiate a payment, we do the work, we get paid. Some people are on contract, some people work full-time for a company. If that's your case, that's a little different, but we're going to talk about this for now. Now, this is going to touch a little bit on what we talked about in episode 2, where I talked about the difference between being a specialist and a generalist. And of course, part of the reason to not take a job is because it's not something that's your main thing. It's out of your wheelhouse, if you will. Another reason would be a bad client, right? Somebody who's got a bad reputation. And finally, it could be a social conscious reason. Maybe a company has different beliefs, public beliefs, than you do. Because we have to remember that as freelancers, we are our company. So our face is our company. If we do work for a certain type of company or a certain area of the, let's say, a political spectrum, that does on some level connect us to it. We have to consider that. And if that's something we want to happen. So let's jump into each one of these. I'm just going to start off with a story, as always. When I first started as a photographer, I had moved from Massachusetts to Miami because it seemed like a good thing to do. And I, to be young and ignorant and blissful, I was 23. I had all the confidence in the world to be a fashion photographer. And I just moved. I thought, I'm going to get down there and start shooting fashion. Didn't work out exactly like that. And I did end up doing a lot of different things. I went down, I realized quickly that I wasn't going to immediately start shooting fashion, and I should probably work as a photo assistant to learn a bit more, which was great. But I also didn't know enough to try to work for fashion photographers, so I worked for all kinds of people. And in the end, that is great. For me, that worked out fantastic because I learned a lot of different skill sets. I was learning product photography, I was learning food photography, editorial, some fashion, of course, advertising, like big product advertising, stuff like that. And this was great. It made me very well-rounded. But because of that, I was able to also take a lot of different jobs. So I did a lot of more generalist type of work at the beginning. Now, if I had just stayed super focused, I probably would have got into shooting fashion earlier. And that's probably more a discussion for the generalist versus specialist conversation. But just in general, that was kind of how I came up. Now, that meant that when I decided to start shooting, because I had more of a skill set, let's say, I did take a lot of different types of jobs. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I guess I want to start out by saying, don't say, I'm a portrait photographer, so I'm never going to shoot a product. Of course not. Sometimes you're going to do things outside your general wheelhouse. When we talk about specialists versus generalists, we're talking more about how you advertise or put yourself forward in the world. That being said, once you've got a bit more of a foot in the door and you are known on some level, you're working in a certain trade, you're working in a certain area, you need to now consider that every job you take is like a job interview for the next job. So you don't want to be somebody who makes amazing images at weddings, let's say, and then take a job shooting a catalog and completely blow it, because that might get around, right? It might hurt your reputation in a sense. It's going to say, well, I thought, Daniel was this great photographer, but he shot this catalog and it was, how come his wedding pictures look like this, but the wedding catalog looked terrible? Well, obviously there's a lot of different reasons why that might be the case. Actually, that sounds like a whole other podcast in itself, right? But, the idea of shooting a portrait of a bride at a wedding is much different than shooting an actual dress catalog where you have to show all the detail. You're trying to sell the dress. It's a whole other kind of area. And again, you might shoot, let's say, the cover for such a magazine in the way that you'd shoot a wedding, but you wouldn't shoot the interior, you wouldn't shoot the details necessarily in the same way. So the job you do might not meet the level of photographer that you are, right? Like you are the best, right? But then you shoot this and you're only mediocre. This can be bad. So we want to consider that. And of course, obviously, everybody's in different places depending on how much work's coming in, where they are in their career. You don't want to be turning down work and then, not have food to eat that month. So we've got to keep all those considerations going. But if you are in a position where you can consider work or not, you don't need to take every single job that comes in because you've got enough work coming in steadily, then we do want to keep this in mind. When a job comes in, think about it. Don't immediately reject something that's outside your wheelhouse, but think about Is this something that I feel like I will do a great job with? Is this something that's going to push my career or push me into a career if we're kind of starting? Is this the thing that I want to do, or could this be detrimental? And really the answer is probably both. And what we want to do is weigh risk versus reward, right? How much risk is there if I blow this thing? How much reward is there if I succeed? If you do this project and nobody's ever going to see it, unless you screw it up, then probably not worth it, even if there's a bunch of money involved, unless obviously the money is more important at that moment, based on what's going on with you. So you really do want to consider that, right? It's kind of like those memes that are like, you can't pay your rent with exposure, which 100%, maybe that's a whole other podcast too. Wow, I'm getting lots of little side things here. Let me know if you guys want to hear me talk about that kind of stuff, exposure. I'm going to talk a little bit about it right now, but those kind of things. You can always call into the show, leave a message using the Anchor app, but there's a link in the description below. But anyways, you see those things. But, when I was starting out, and, to a certain extent, probably still true as a fashion photographer, you shot editorial, and that was mostly for exposure. I mean, you made some money, but you weren't making a ton of money as an editorial fashion photographer. But being in the magazines got your name in front of people, and people that were in the industry, that were designers and stuff, read fashion magazines. When you sent your postcards or you sent your portfolio in for review at these design houses, they would look at the name and be like, I've seen that name before, because they saw it in the magazine. That's the exposure. Now, that being said, if it's a poster where your name's not on it anywhere, then how much exposure is that poster really going to give you? So we do want to consider, again, that's a whole other thing, but we want to consider what we're getting from this particular project and what it will cost us in reputation or time or whatever if we are unsuccessful. I can say that when I was first starting, that I took many a job where it took way longer than I thought, because it was outside, again, my wheelhouse. It cost more than I thought because, again, it was outside my wheelhouse. There were jobs I lost money on, and these were learning times. And this was early in my career when I really needed to do every job I could, which made it even worse when I lost money on them. But over time, I discovered what I was good at, what I was best at is maybe a better way to say it, and how to handle different types of projects, and also how to say no, which is what we're talking about here, right? If we're looking at a job, and the reason why this came up is I was actually just asked to do a job that, while I know that I'm totally capable of pulling off, it was so far outside my wheelhouse, and it was something that was pretty public. And I thought to myself, I could do this, sure. But if it goes south, this is not going to be good for me. So I need to consider, okay, so it's paying this, do I have enough income coming in? If I don't take the job, what's going on there? And I decided no. And I just straight up told the client, I said, I don't think this is the type of thing that I would be amazing at. Like, I appreciate being offered, but the reality is I think there's people that do this all the time, and they'll probably deliver better what you want. And that was it. I mean, it's easy enough to do that. We are adults. For some reason, most of us, I think that for some reason people are always nervous that if they say no, they'll never work again. But the reality is if you're honest with the client, then usually they'll usually get, if they like your work. Clients contact you, hopefully, because they like you. They like working with you. We've talked about this a bit before. They like your personality. Part of being a successful photographer or artist is to be fun and enjoyable and nice to work with, right? If you work with somebody and they really like working with you, then they will reach out to you again when they have projects, even if occasionally you have to say, I can't do this one. The same is true for clients. If you are a bad client, and this, you could be this as a photographer or filmmaker or artist, if you're hiring freelancers to help you, like makeup artists or other crew, if you're a bad client, people aren't going to want to work for you. I've definitely fired clients in my day many times. Sometimes I took a loss on it, but in the end, it's worth it, because when we are working with a bad client, and I'm going to talk about a few different types of bad clients, it is not going to allow us to produce the best work, which, again, your work, every piece of work you do is your next resume, right? So if you're working for a bad client that is over demanding on the set, asks for things that they wasn't in the contract, this is problematic. This is the kind of client that you might fire on the job. Don't do this unless you really have to, because this can really hurt your reputation, especially if they're well known, and not well known to be bad. This is the reason why we need to have fairly tight contracts. I say fairly because you can overword things and make them, too extreme, but you definitely want to list on your contract exactly what you are producing for exactly what fee. That way, when you put on the contract 5 shots, shot this day with this kind of camera at this location for this money, and then they want to do a 6th shot, you can say, okay, well, we do have enough time, but I'm going to have to add 20% to the bill because that's an additional shot. They shouldn't have a problem with that. And that would be a good client, right? A bad client is going to want you to do, well, hold on, there's still 2 hours left in the day. Let's shoot extra. It's like, well, no, we did the job. We did the 5 shots that was on the thing. We're being paid for these 5 shots. Now, of course, if your thing says as many shots as you can do in a day, then okay. But now a bad client in that case would be like, hold on, you've already taken 15 minutes for your lunch. You better keep shooting, keep shooting, keep shooting. Again, you don't want to work with those kind of clients. Sometimes you can find these clients through reputation, which is another reason why it's good to have connections in the industry. It's good to work with people. It's good to have community. We've talked about this before as well. If I know that my friend has worked for such and such company, and then that company contacts me, I can say, hey, how are they to work for? This will really help us to, as a community, to help keep those bad clients in their place, right? If photographers kind of stick together, don't just let your buddy or even your competition, right? Unless, I don't know any reason why you would send somebody into a bad client. If you know somebody offhand and they are a photographer and you have some kind of connection with them, even a loose association, and you've worked for a client and they're terrible and they ask you, then you should tell them that. Because again, I think if we can get people to not work for the bad clients, then they won't get the good pros to work for them, and then they'll need to straighten up their act. The other way you can tell if you don't have any kind of connection to a client is oftentimes it comes down to the way they present what they want and what they're paying. If it's unrealistic from the beginning, then again, weigh risk versus reward. If somebody comes to you and says, I want 20 shots done this one day, and this is the budget I have, and it's really, okay, it's fine for a day rate, but really 20 shots is, at least 5 more than you really legit can get done. And you start to negotiate and they're just like hardcore on it and they don't want to change it. This could potentially be a bad client. So this is somebody whose expectations are wrong and you need to help straighten that out as a business person, as a photographer, as whatever. This is true, by the way. I know I refer to a photographer a lot, but if you're an artist, I interact with a lot of people in the gaming sphere, the role-play game sphere, and, artists and stuff that draw for books and draw for zines and stuff like that. And they have the same thing, right? They might have to draw 17 images for a magazine. Make sure that everything's realistic when that job is offered to you. If the client wants 17 things and they only want to pay, the price of what 10 should cost, or they want it 3 times faster than realistic, you might want to not work for them, or weigh the risk versus reward. Okay, they're really hardcore, but these are going to get my images in front of way more people than I've ever had before. Am I willing to work at double time and make this job the only thing I do for the next 2 weeks so I can get this done? Maybe. Again, risk, reward. This last part is going to be a little more vague because things aren't always as black and white or yes or no or whatever here. What I'm talking about is thinking about you as the face of your company, meaning that everything that you photograph, everything that you make a commercial for, everything that you do illustrations for, these all reflect back on you. If you're showing a portfolio of your work and there are controversial themes, if there's controversial companies, if there are things that are very far in one direction or the other politically, then people will see those things and they will make a judgment on you based on that you support those things. And maybe you do, and you are maybe okay putting that out there. But if you're just an artist trying to make a living and you're just working for whoever you can to get the dollar, you've got to consider that in that dollar you get today might actually hurt you in the long run when people see that you worked for X or Y company. Now, I'm not talking about jumping on bandwagons or canceling people or doing any of those kind of things. What I'm talking about is just the idea that you are your company. So if you, for instance, have a company that shoots primarily, let's say, high school portraits. So portraits of people in high school, that's teenagers effectively. And then you are approached by a company that does, let's say, swimwear. And maybe this is like more of a kind of swimwear that, maybe has more of sexy images or whatever. And they're like, oh, we're going to fly you down to Florida and you shoot on the beach. And you might be like, well, that'd be super fun, right? Because why wouldn't you, right? And you go down there and you photograph these pictures and then you put them in your website or whatever. And now you get backlash from parents who look at that and go, oh, I don't want to send my teenager to your studio. You shoot people in skimpy swimwear. And it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with doing that, of course. But in their mind, they're thinking, oh, how do I know this person's not going to try to do that with my teenager? I mean, I don't know what they're thinking, right? But this can certainly happen. And it's something you really want to be conscious of. When I lived in Florida, I'd come back to that, for a while, I was shooting juniors. So you're shooting, 11 to like 14. So I did not put that in the same books as I put any of the other things I was doing, because again, parents who are bringing their children in to be photographed don't want to see some, muscly guy on the beach lifting weights or whatever. They don't want to see things that feel out of context with what they're hiring you for. Obviously, different portfolios can help here. And in the days of physical portfolios, that was a lot easier because they only saw what you showed them, right? These days where everything's online, if you've got a category that's, male bodybuilders, and then you've got tweens, tween fashion, this is going to be on the same place, right? People are going to see it. So we've got to consider the potential clients in the future and how they're going to see your interactions with certain things. Now, this doesn't mean that, like, let's say you're shooting for a prestigious news magazine and they are like, well, there's 2 candidates here in this state for governor, and we want you to photograph both of them. It doesn't mean you can't photograph both sides of the spectrum and showcase that fairly. I mean, that's what we do, right? But you've got to also consider that that's also for a big magazine, and you'll have both images, and, or even if you only had the one image, it doesn't necessarily mean you support everything you photograph. But if one of those 2 candidates likes their photo and they're like, hey, I want to take you on the campaign trail with me and photograph the process, now you've got to decide, do I want to be the photographer for this side of the political spectrum? And, in an ideal world, if I'm being honest of how I feel, it shouldn't be a problem. However, it can be. So we definitely want to consider that. Consider that if you put a bunch of pictures of a certain, let's say, celebrity or politician or type of images in your portfolio, it may turn off people that are opposed to that, whatever it is. So be wary of that. And then again, I started off this section by saying this is the trickiest one, and it is, right? It's not always going to be the case. There's times where you might want to work for a company that's outside your kind of vibe because it's okay. It feels right to do those images. Sometimes you're not going to want to, even if the images do feel right, because that person, place, company, whatever, might be too controversial to your main body of clients, and you've got to consider those. If we are just artists creating and we're not worrying about commerce anywhere, we're just creating for the joy of creation, this is much less of an issue, obviously. But if we have the desire to put our work in front of people and also be paid for it at some point, it's important to consider the reputation that you are building. Like I said earlier, avoid bad clients. To the consumer, they're going to think avoid bad creators, photographers, whatever. Oh, that person has a reputation because they did this. That can be bad. So be wary, whether it's fair or not. It's the way it is. Photographers are often thought of in a certain light, and you want to be very careful of protecting your reputation. So I'd be curious what you all have to say here. You can, of course, check the show notes for a link to the Anchor page where you can leave a voice message up to 1 minute long. You can also send me an email at rmavoice@gmail.com. You can attach a voice message, just record it on any voice recorder you have, and I'll play it here on the show. Or you can just write up an email and say, hey, read this, and I will, which we're going to do later in the show. And let's continue this conversation. Okay, we've got an email from Mark here with a little bit of a question, so I'll read it and we'll talk about it. Daniel, just listened to your first podcast and have been a longtime viewer of your YouTube creations. I have what I think might be a topic, at least for me. How do you make the leap to becoming a full-time professional photographer? Okay, then he goes into the fact that he's got a family business, that he's been supporting his family for 30 years, but he loves photography and he wants to do this more full-time. Well, I talked about this a little bit a few episodes back, so he'll probably get there eventually. But what I will say, and again, everybody is a little bit different, and handing out advice to somebody who I've only gotten one email from is, take this advice with as it is. It's tough. And one of the big things you have to decide is the risk worth the reward? If you've got a house and a mortgage and a family and a good job, is it worth not having the house anymore and not being able to give the things to your family you're currently giving with that good job if you leave it? And it's trickier the older we get. Not impossible, one of the great things about being a creator is that for many of us anyways, we can do it and do other things. So generally my advice to people who are more, we'll say, established in the world, generally that means older, but not always, is to ease into it. Get yourself going. Get to a point where you've got a fairly decent amount of income, then make that decision. It's probably not going to necessarily exceed your job if you have a good job, good job meaning that it's well paying. But when it gets close, even 75% of it, and then you look and say, well, if we cut this, now, okay, not having, 5 streaming channels and or a second car or going on 1 week less vacation a year might be worth all the other freedom you get from being a photographer. And of course, obviously the love of it. So that's kind of that. Now, if you're younger, like if you're like in your 20s and you've got nothing to lose in a lot of ways, like that's the way I thought when I was in my 20s, is then I would just go for it. What have you got to lose? As I said, when I was 23, I quit a very good job and threw everything I owned and into my car. And then the rest of it I gave to charity and stuff and moved with no connections, no real prospects. And when I look back at it now, I'm like, wow, that was really brave or stupid or maybe a combination of both. But again, if you have a fallback, if you do have a family that will take you back if you lose your apartment, and you're not supporting people, then I think that it's easier to take that risk. So that's kind of the mixed thing. I might talk more about getting more professionally into the arts. Let me know, send me an email like Mark did here, @avoice@gmail.com. Again, you can either send an email or attach a voice message, or you can leave a message using the Anchor app. The link is in the description below. And let me know if you want to hear more about that kind of stuff. Like, I can do some what if scenarios. I could tell some more of my history about how I did it. Not that that's necessarily going to work for you, but you can at least get some ideas if that interests you all. So let me know. I try to keep the show based on what people are asking for. So hopefully that was helpful, Mark. What I would say is, based on what you're saying there, I would probably ease into it until I knew that there was enough income there that I wouldn't take anything away from my family that they weren't willing to also sacrifice. Because this is the thing too, right? Your family might be like, it's fine. We'll go on 1 week less vacation a year. We'll, not have the top end car next time we buy a car because we want you to do this business. Or they might be like, no, we want a vacation. Okay. So, it depends. And, you can't fault them either way, right? If you've provided a certain lifestyle and they're enjoying it, why would they take that sacrifice unless they really felt like it was going to make you really, really happy? And maybe they would. I don't know. I don't know your family. I'm not making a judgment there. I think if my father was like, I'm going to quit my job and you're all going to have to, eat peanut butter sandwiches when I was 13, I probably would have been like, what? So yeah, I can't say that I would have been any other way. But anyways, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know you well enough to know one way or the other, but just a general piece of advice, I would say that if you have a certain standard of living, you might want to get to close to it with your side work, we'll say, or side creations before you take the risk, or at the very least have some kind of a buffer, like a 6 months or 9 months worth of money so that you can fully invest in it. Because what should happen as you start to grow the business is it's going to be hard at first, but once you hit a certain point, it generally starts to grow on its own. If you're a good photographer and if you're a good business person, and then when I say good, I mean not screwing people over and fun to work with and stuff like that. I think the technical stuff is anybody can figure that out. But yeah, if you have the right personality for it, I think you can do it. Like for instance, this is kind of another side thing, but this is a conversation that often came up with photo assistants. When do they would come to New York or Miami when I lived there, and they'd be like, wow, it's so hard to live as a photo assistant. I'm living in an apartment with 5 other people and this and that. And I have friends who just got regular jobs and they're doing better than me, and it's struggle. And I would always say, if you stick with it, you will eventually get your reputation well enough that you will do well. And I would have some that would break down and get a job because they just couldn't live that lifestyle of being more broke, and others that stuck with it. And then, a year later, we're making more than the person that took the job. And then we're on their way to being professionals, because it kind of depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice to get to that point. But of course, nothing is guaranteed. Adorama supports this podcast, and you can support them by going to adorama.com for any of your photo, video, electronics, and audio needs. You can also check out adorama.com/create no matter what for any of the contests that are going on where you can win all kinds of cool gear. All those links are in the show notes. Okay, we have a great review this week from Blackjack via Apple Podcasts in Switzerland. Good for thought, 5 stars. Love the way Daniel presents his thoughts about photography. From his own experience to his feelings. Everything worth to be listened. Very insightful podcast, and he has the little prayer hand things, which is nice. I always like a good emoji. Well, thanks, Blackjack. That was really the impetus behind this podcast, was that I wanted to make it something that was truly kind of a personal vlog, if you will, from a creator's point of view. Reviews are some of the best ways to grow a small podcast like this one. So if you're listening and enjoying and you'd like to help out the podcast, if you could rate the podcast, ideally 5 stars, and leave a review. I read all the reviews I get on the air here, so it could be your review next week. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear your voice on the show, you can check the show notes below. There is a link to the Anchor page where you can leave messages up to 1 minute. You can also record a voice message any way you want to do it and attach it to an email. Send it to adoramavoice@gmail.com, or you can just type something up like Mark did and I will read it. Just let me know when you send the email, and I'll talk to you soon.